So who's my running back 3? Yeah, it's Tank Bigsby. Look, I did a longer video breaking down Tank's profile pretty much as I was discovering it, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. There are volume concerns here compared to players like Jonathan Taylor and Bijan Robinson or Christian McCaffrey or definitely Derrick Henry. But I think you see a versatility in his profile that's somewhat between Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson, in that he's not a Jahmyr Gibbs in the receiving game, but he's still more actively used than Jonathan Taylor, or again, many premium running backs with this level of expectation of draft capital were. And he's performing better than Jahmyr Gibbs, for my money, in terms of being a rusher. So he's kind of a midpoint in a few ways between the profiles. Then we enter another tier in this running back, which is pretty thick, in the 2023 class, and that's where you're taking shots at who's going to be more necessarily than their numbers are. And the versatility, the variety of things that Tank Bigsby does well, even despite some limitations, that for me adds up to more than the sum of its parts. Go check out that other video, but I really like Tank Bigsby's profile. I see a lot more than the sum of its parts in there, and he's my running back 3 in this year's class. So who's my running back 4 in this year's class? Zach Wine, or Zach Charbonnet, for those who actually like to use the player's real name. Zach brings with him a lot of good, and before we get into it, I just want to point out that this is going to be a feature increasingly of players as we move forward in fantasy football and the NFL, of players entering the transfer portal and playing in multiple different teams and maybe coming out at older ages, so it's worth noting how we start to approach those situations. So here's Zach Charbonnet. He played 2 years at Michigan and then 2 years at UCLA, moving from the Big Ten to the Pac-12, and you can see he really kicked off in his final 2 seasons, although that first year with Michigan he did a 40% rushing dominator with a 31% of the overall rushing yards, or rushing opportunities, so he did do some work in Michigan as well, and you can see that in that second year he only played 5 games, where every other season he was playing more than enough games. So as long as there aren't injury concerns and empty games where he's calling game starts and not game finishes, and most of these seasons are worthy of profiling, they're above the basic volume threshold. So here's some things to know about Zach Charbonnet's profile. He gets a lower score on my overall model, which I think I include in my ranks as well, just in case you're wondering. The fact that he has a lower drafted rate, now because it uses his UCLA team's drafted rate, which is pretty much 0. Which means his entire model score is coming from his production. He's getting no boost from where he was playing or how much expectation we can have with draft capital. Splitting the work very early with Hassan Haskins in his first year, he led Michigan in points per game and edged out Haskins in workload with 31% of the team's overall receiving yards versus 25 Hassan Haskins, which is a difficult name for me to say apparently. In his second season, for want of a better word, was a mess. He only played 5 games like we saw. The team really struggled. In fact, the most anyone played in that year was 6 games, so I assume it was COVID related. And Zach fell down the opportunity ladder even through those 5 games, barely getting 11% of the overall rushing opportunities and 5 attempts per game. He just basically wasn't utilized, which is a question. But then when he transfers and moves closer to where his family actually comes from, I found out through a little extra research, which is pretty heartwarming to be honest with you, he fully takes on a workhorse workload for UCLA. Now, UCLA's best addition to the NFL, most recently, has been Josh Kelly. But despite the lack of pedigree, he immediately rose to the top of the depth chart, carried the ball for 40% of the team's overall opportunity, and with more than 2 targets a game, and 112's elusiveness rating in that first season. That's above average, and it's above the average of players who go on to have 2 top 12 seasons. Again, they're all playing in different situations and different conferences, so it's worth peering at that a little bit. But you see, he was well over that 97% average in those final 2 years. And remember, it's okay to just take the best year of the running back where he was getting 122. And the best running backs tend to obliterate that average of 97, to be honest with you. There were way too many running backs who didn't do much in college or had bad elusiveness ratings that dragged that number down. So it's worth noting that above average is more common for the best prospects. Zach fits that bill. Now, if you take the story of his final 2 seasons in the Pac-12 with UCLA and that lower drafted rate, you see a workhorse with above average elusiveness rating and above average yards after contact per attempt numbers, much like Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs and Tank Bigsby, But for my money, I think when you consider all three in context, next to Zach Charbonnet, you see someone that's more like Tank Bigsby and is not quite as good in terms of his performance stats, even in those final 2 years. Again, they're great, but they're not quite as good as Tank's on smaller volume, in yards after contact per attempt, or in elusiveness rating. And while he was more heavily used on a routes per game basis, getting 19 routes per game in his third season, or his first season with UCLA, and 24 routes per game in his second season, which is more than even Jahmyr Gibbs was getting in an average season, he was also targeted at a decent rate, actually slightly less than Bijan Robinson was at 14 targets per route run. He was more at 10 targets per route run throughout the majority of his career, but even if you take out that weird second season, I think his usage profile is as good as we could hope for, even in a second tier of most running back classes, to be honest with you, with 2.4 targets per game for his career as an entirety and 30% target share rate if you just average seasons where he played more than 8 games. And Zach Wine looks like a running back with a lot to offer, the right landing spot with the right draft capital, and honestly I'd expect to see him be that guy who works his way into a role, even if the landing spot isn't exactly perfect or the draft capital isn't exactly everything we want. He's a running back who could easily make it into the late first round, but in a positive way of rookie drafts, will be an absolute steal in the second round if anyone's sleeping on his potential in the NFL. So this year's running back class is really good. The top of it is exceptional. And the second tier of it is exceptional in most draft classes, as long as you understand exceptional what. And tier 3 for me is like a tier 2 in most classes, and actually has 3 players in it, which I'm normally lucky to get 3 players. I don't have a lot of concerns outside of the draft and outside of landing spot, which is hard to adjust for anyway. Player 5, my 5th ranked running back, and again, Tank Bigsby, Zach Charbonnet, and this guy are all in tier 3 for me. Admit it, part of you was like, he's gonna say Deuce Vaughn, isn't he? He's crazy, he's a crazy man. And I am, but not that crazy just yet. Devon Achane is more than crazy enough for me right now. It's more than dismissive enough of the combine that I'm comfortable that it's me, and I'm doing my own thing. But the NFL's gonna care, and it may limit his upside relative to everyone else I've got in tier 3. His final season, he dominated opportunity at the running back position, and this more similar to how Jonathan Taylor did in his final season than anyone else we've talked about. He got a 66% rushing dominator, and while it's not a particularly predictive stat, it is a good descriptive one. And his performance stats are kind of good too, though not as good as some of the other ones we looked at. In his first year, where he only played 6 games, and we can mostly dismiss that because the volume ultimately wasn't there, and it's really hard to judge performance stats when the volume isn't there. 185 elusiveness rating and 5.2 yards after contact per attempt, which would be insane unless your name's Bijan Robinson, and then you just do that on the regular. Anyway, so his next 2 seasons he's getting 4 yards after contact per attempt, which again the average is 3, and then 3.6. So his average, even over 8 games played, is well above the average of most players who go on to have 2 top 12 seasons. And it's a similar story with elusiveness rating. While not quite as impressive, he was getting 112 elusiveness rating his second to last season, or his second season at 19, and 93 in his final season. The average is easily above the best year of most running backs who go on to have 2 top 12 seasons. It's not as impressive as the first 3 players I talked about. The volume is better than Tank Bigsby overall, because he's more of a workhorse, at least relative to that team in Texas A&M. But his performance stats, his elusiveness rating, yards after contact, aren't quite as impressive as the heights, at least, of most of the guys I've already mentioned. So ultimately, Devon Achane is tiny, but very good. We have to see what the NFL thinks, especially after the combine. Right now, where my head goes to is James Cook, but actually underrated. I have less than 3 down expectations for him, but I think he can easily contribute on both sides of the ball. His adjusted yards per team attempt is 2.4, 11% above the SEC average, and that's elite for relative to your conference level. His yards after contact is good. The average is 3.7 and his is 3.6, but again, mostly I'll default to best, and even if we ignore that first season, his best season easily clears that bar. As long as he gets the draft capital and goes to an offense that you think can utilize a player with a dynamic skill set, but is maybe more limited in both rushing and receiving relative to his performance stats in the SEC, because of the NFL's expectation of what they can utilize him for because of his size. So a little bit of a weird profile. I like him though. So thanks very much, and I will see you again in the next video.